All right, there it goes. So, like I said, you guys should be able to identify the type of muscle by the different characteristics and know the general location of these muscles, and then be able to describe nervous tissue as well as identify it. So, what that means is when we look at muscle tissue, the overall function is they are highly specialized cells um, that contract or shorten to produce movement. And so muscle cells all look similar in that they are very long and thin and provide a long axis of contraction. And so if you're like, well, how do muscle cells contract? We are going to spend a whole unit on that later on this semester. So all you guys need to know for now is that muscle cells contract and shorten to cause movement. We'll talk about how that happens in more detail later on. And so muscle cells are also known as muscle fibers. So if you ever hear me say muscle cells or fibers, those are synonyms. You can change them in, or you can use them in the same way. And that there are going to be three types of muscle tissue that we talk about. We're going to talk about skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, where they're found, what they generally do, and how to identify them. So skeletal muscle is what we characterize our muscular system around. So it's surrounded and packaged by connective tissue. So we will get to see that, but sometimes you can even see that connective tissue. It almost looks like a silvery color, but we'll see that later on. And our skeletal muscle is controlled voluntarily. So that means we can think about it, we can move it, right? Like as I'm talking with my hands, like I always do, I am thinking about it and can cause my arms to move, my legs to move, my head to move. So all of those voluntary muscles, those are all skeletal muscles. And so when they contract, they pull on bones or skin by connecting tendons to the body movement. And like we said, all muscle cells are long and cylindrical, but what is unique about skeletal muscles is that they are multinucleated. So what the heck that means is that they contain a lot of nuclei. Which is really cool. So like when you look at this picture here, and I know it's a little hard to see, maybe if I zoom in a little bit, there it is. So all of these dark spots right here, those are all of the nuclei. And so this is one muscle fiber or muscle cell, and all of those dark spots around it are nuclei for that one muscle fiber. And so the reason that it's multinucleated is so that it can move a lot, right? Because these are voluntary muscles. They have to move a lot. And so we want them to have lots of nuclei in them. The other key, here I'll zoom out, and we'll go to our next slide. The next key feature that tells us it's skeletal muscle, besides having many nuclei or being multinucleated, is that they have striations. So I'm going to zoom in for you guys here. And so do you guys see these lines here in each of the muscle fibers? So see those vertical lines that are everywhere? Those are striations. And what they do is they allow the muscles, our skeletal muscles, to contract forcefully and consistently and quickly. And so that's one of the things about skeletal muscles is there's three types. There's fast twitch, slow twitch, and intermediate. And you can tell the three types by the amount of striations that they have. I'm not going to make you do that. We will talk about the different types of fast twitch, slow twitch, and intermediate later on. But I just need you guys to know for now is to be able to identify that these striations are in skeletal muscle only. Okay. Our next type of, sorry, I shouldn't have said only. I always do that. Of muscle is cardiac muscle. Cardiac is a word for our heart. And so cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. So it is the muscle that makes up our heart. And if you guys think about it, it's got to be a good muscle because our heart bumps a lot. It has striations. So I'll zoom in. And it has nuclei. but not quite as many, and the striations are not as definitive. And the muscle fibers don't look as organized as our skeletal muscle. So remember, the color is just because of the stain that we use. The main way that I tell that it's cardiac muscle is there's these things called Philly. Hey! Harriet and Lloyd! Philly! Harriet! Sorry, guys. So the main way that I tell it's cardiac muscle is this feature called intercalated discs. So you guys see, so our muscle fibers are running up and at this direction. These intercalated discs run perpendicular to the direction of the muscle. So there are these little dashes here that are in the muscle. And so that is a key feature of cardiac muscle. And these increase the heart rate contraction rate. So they just allow, those intercalated discs allow the heart to contract more often. And so one of the characteristics that you guys need to know for muscle is if it's controlled voluntary or involuntary. And so cardiac muscle is an example of involuntary. It's controlled by our autonomic nervous system, meaning we don't have to think about it for it to contract. It's automatically going to do what it needs to do based on what we're doing, right? Like if you start exercising, your heart rate's going to pump faster because your body needs more blood delivery. And so we don't want to have to tell our heart to pump faster. We just want it to automatically happen. And so that's why it's involuntarily controlled. And then our last type of muscle fiber is smooth muscle, also known as visceral. It has no striations. It is one-celled and it's spindle-shaped. So I'm going to zoom in on that sample for you guys. So tends to be a little bit thinner too. So this is our smooth muscle. You can tell there's not as many dark spots because there's only one nucleus per cell. And so it makes up the walls of our hollow organs. So it's found in the stomach, the bladder, the uterus, and the blood vessels. And so what it does is it contracts when we need to move materials through our digestive system or our urinary system. And that contraction is called peristalsis. And so we don't need it to happen as much or as often. And so that's why we don't see the striations in it. And it doesn't have as much nuclei as the cardiac and the skeletal muscle. So, because if you think about it, can you imagine your digestive muscles contracting as often as your heart or your skeletal muscles? I don't think we would feel very good, right? So that's why it doesn't have to have as many nuclei and it doesn't have striations because it's not going to contract as often. They're slower. And the last part is that skeletal muscle contractions are also involuntary, like cardiac muscle, right? You don't want to tell your small intestine to move your food through to your large intestine. You just want it to naturally happen the way that your body needs it to. This is a great picture to show you that muscle tendon junction. So muscle is our third type of tissue we've talked about. And tendons were an example of our dense connective tissue that we just finished. And so what I want you guys to see, we'll do it there. So here's our skeletal muscle. So there's all those nuclei in the skeletal muscle. And you can kind of see the striations in it. And then there's our tendon. That's our example of dense connective tissue. So usually when we think about kind of the order that we find things in, epithelial is always on the outside, and then you'll see your connective tissue is the next layer, and then muscles will be next. And then inside all of that is our nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is a group of neurons or a nervous cell. And so these are specialized cells that receive and conduct electrical chemical impulses from around the body. They are very, very specialized. And like I said, the reason that we don't go into a ton of detail about how they work is because we're going to spend an entire unit on how the nervous system functions later this semester. But the main thing that I want you guys to be able to recognize is the overall structure. So this is the cell body. I think sometimes kids get it confused with areolar loose connective tissue because this stuff in here looks like the fibers of the extracellular matrix, but it's not. We can tell this is a neuron because it's got one single nuclei in the middle, and then these are dendrites coming off of it, which you guys will learn more about later. But what I think is really cool is that neurons can be up to 1 meter long. So if you think about it, the neurons that are in your spinal cord is one long neuron. And so they can be really long. And neurons have supporting cells and we'll talk more about those supporting cells later on, but in our central nervous system, so our brain, there's going to be supporting cells that help the neurons function that we're going to talk about later. All right. And that's our last one. So I'm going to pause